Good morning. I'm Ian Douglas from the Commonwealth Human Ecology Council in Manchester, England, and I am facilitating this session representing the Commonwealth Human Ecology Council, I shall call it CHEC, and the people at CHEC who are presently at COP in Glasgow, reporting to you every day. Very delighted to meet the speakers this morning, and I'd like to say kia ora and welcome everybody. And I'll just make a few general points then about cities before we start. Adaptation to climate change is particularly linked to urban poverty, because the urban poor are the most vulnerable to climate change in many things. They live very often in situations that are more risky, either on the water's edge, on floodplains, or perhaps in areas that are likely to be affected by landslides that are set off by heavy rains. In planning and improving and adapting cities, we need to consider how human health and well-being cannot be separated from the impacts of climate change. We have to note that many urban communities in many countries have been able to develop their own strategies for dealing with the impacts of climate change because governments have failed to assist them. And what we need is integrated thinking, the interlinking of environmental and social policies, the integration of action, and attention to the detailed delivery of actions, particularly in areas where you have differing local social situations, differing abilities to move around and respond to things. We need to think carefully. And thus leads us to the idea that we have to combine what we might call top-down approaches from central governments and regional governments and bottom-up approaches from communities. And we have to integrate the activities of everybody from individuals, and I can't overemphasize individual responsibility. Our founder of the Human Ecology Council was very strong on that. NGOs, local communities, local governments, private enterprises, regional governments, and national governments. And this is where we have to consider all these complex factors. We therefore need in these discussions to think how we blend our local knowledge with the assistance that comes from higher levels. And we're very fortunate in having people who represent the national government, the local communities, local organisations and community groups this evening. Could I now please invite Dr. Gaurav Sharma to make his presentation. I expect most people know that Dr. Sharma is the MP for Hamilton West, and I'm very glad, Dr. Sharma, to have you here this evening. Kia ora, we're glad to hear you.
Sure, and thank you, Ian. Inga mana inga reo rangatirama, tena koto tena tatu katua. Inga Himalayas ke India oku maonga tuatahi. Ingari ko pirongia te maonga inainai. Ko Satluj toku awa tuatahi. Ingari ko Waikato te awa inainai. Ke Frankton kirikiriro toku kainga inainai. Ko Sharma toku Fano, ko Gaurav toku Ingwa. Ko aute mema parimata mo kirikiriro ki te uru. Noku te onore te tu ke muai e koto. Norera tena koto tena tatu katoa. Sure, everyone. My name is Gaurav Sharma. I'm the Member of Parliament for Hamilton West electorate in New Zealand. And what I was just saying before was I was just doing a pipiha, which is basically a Maori tradition where we talk about our inheritance. You know, we talk about our heritage, where we come from, I guess, because that kind of decides and gives you an example of where we are heading. And I think a lot of the conversation today about climate change is focused around that. Before we can talk about, you know, what it is that we can do around climate change, we need to know what it is that we have already done and what it is that we actually haven't been able to do. So as far as, you know, the New Zealand government is concerned, I'm incredibly proud to be part of a government that has, you know, taken climate change very seriously. And in the last 4 years, the Labour government has done, you know, more than any of the other governments have been able to do in this sector. And a lot of it is obviously being born out of necessity because of the times we live in. You know, the climate crisis is nearing, it is already here, and we need to act on it. I just wanted to quickly share some of the things that the government has been able to do in the last 4 years leading up to the COP26 summit. So starting with when we came into government 4 years ago, we ended new offshore oil and gas exploration. We passed the Zero Carbon Act and became one of the first countries to put the 1.5 degree Celsius global warming threshold into our primary legislation. We established the Climate Change Commission, and we've now got our 3 emissions budgets lined up. We've overhauled the emission trading scheme and have put a lid on emissions for the first time. We actually started planting 1 billion trees and invested $1.2 billion in what's called Jobs for Nature program. So that is around creating jobs which are helping look after our environment. We invested $1 billion into buses, trains, cycling and walking infrastructure. Here in Hamilton, we've just invested $90 million to restart a train, which hasn't existed for many decades. And it just means we've got a new way of transporting people between our biggest city, Auckland, and Hamilton, where I'm from. We're investing in EV charging infrastructure around the economy. We've started to replace the entire government fleet with our zero emission vehicles. We brought in vehicle emission standards for new imports for the first time in New Zealand. We brought back the mandate to include biofuels in the petrol, which we'll still be using until everybody, you know, transitions to an electric fleet. We've set up a new energy research center in Taranaki, which is part of New Zealand, to kickstart the hydrogen economy. We're helping businesses to switch to clean energy with government investment in Decarbonizing Industry Fund. We're starting to replace our own coal boilers in schools and hospitals and universities with clean alternatives. We've started the Building for Climate Change program to cut emissions from building and construction. I'll come back to it in a bit. We've invested in warmer Kiwi homes. We've doubled the climate change related aid to Pacific countries. We declared a climate emergency and committed the public service to carbon neutrality by 2025. We also became the first country in the world to legislate for a price on agricultural emissions. And we're currently building the world's only farm level emission measurements, management, and pricing system. We introduced legislation to require all listed companies and large financial institutions to report on their climate related risks. So a lot of things have been done leading up to this COP26 summit. But I think there's a lot more that can be done. And, you know, when especially talking about building and construction sector, one of the things you were talking about, Ian, was that, you know, everything is interlinked. In my previous life, before I became a member of parliament, I was a medical doctor in the community. And you know, I just saw how housing can affect people's health in causing asthma, you know, how bad transportation can affect people's health in different ways. So the building sector is not any different from any other sector. We need to make sure, you know, there is good public transport. We need to make sure that there are parks available for people to exercise. We need to make sure that the construction industry itself isn't utilizing materials that's, you know, adding more to the carbon emissions. But it is a very interconnected system. And I think the part of the problem has been that often the policies have been very patchwork. People in governments often focus on one side and then forget the completely different part of the interconnected system. But things are changing. And one of the you know, practical examples I wanted to give you was of Scion, which is a research institute in New Zealand, in Rotorua. And what they've done is for around local climate change issues, they've developed this beautiful 3-story building. It's got a double skin facade, which provides heat recovery in winter with its colored glazing panels. And then there's the internal building cavity, which regulates thermal gains during summertime. And then they've got, you know, natural ventilation, they've got solar shading, they've got LED lighting, all sorts of things that are involved in reducing the ongoing and running costs, but also in terms of helping with, you know, with their sort of climate change impact. Most of the building is actually constructed with wood. And even though, you know, the building wasn't designed to be carbon negative, using wood instead of the alternative construction materials has meant that, you know, they've been able to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and fossil fuel consumption during the production and building of this beautiful building. And what we've learned from that is, you know, like you can have a really beautiful architectural building, but you can also do it in a more sustainable way, and in a way that it's not just that one-off construction, but also the maintenance of the building. And similarly, New Zealand Parliament is now looking at building a new annex, and they've all gone actually to the Scion building in Rotorua to learn from what they've been able to do in this sphere. So I guess as far as you know, the challenges ahead are concerned, you know, there's a lot that is being done, but I do acknowledge that there is more to be done, and we're just in the first steps. And time is running out. You know, our commitment was 2050 and 2030. It's not too far down the road with 2022 almost. So 8 to 9 years before we're going to be, you know, judged on our impact as well. But that's all I've got to say for now. And if there's any questions, I can take it towards the end of this session.
Thank you so much, Gaurav. It's nice to have confirmation that, as usual, New Zealand is leading the world by a good example. I hope you can get the building regulations to insist that all new buildings have their own power generation from solar panels, and they have proper insulation to cut down energy consumption and so on. It's amazing that we don't keep abreast of the technology availability to improve building regulations. But thank you very much for the moment. Can I now please move on to Rupert? Kia ora, Rupert. I understand that you're a man with similar interests to mine. My children remind me that when they were young, I would go out into the countryside for a trip, and I'd always be stopping to fill bottles up with dirty water to find out what was being carried down the streams. And I think your work, you are a very practical environmentalist, solving problems, keeping us healthy. We're looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Okay, kia ora Ian, kia ora koutou, ko Rupert Craggs toko inua. I'm a principal scientist at another Crown Research Institute in New Zealand called NIWA, National Institute of Water and Atmospheric Research. And I work in the Aquatic Pollution Mitigation Group, which is based here in Hamilton. And I work with a very talented group of scientists in the Freshwater and Estuaries Centre, specifically looking at the causes and effects of water quality degradation. And much of our work is relevant for cities and the built environment. We have projects looking at urban stormwater and specifically heavy metal leaching off roofs and toxicity to aquatic life. And of course, with climate change and increased rainfall in places, that will be exacerbated. We're looking at demonstrating, I guess, techniques for measuring water quality in real time. Most of our water quality measurements at the moment are just grab samples that happen maybe once a week or if we're lucky, hourly. But to have these in-stream real-time technologies that will tell you as water quality varies on a minute-by-minute basis is really, really going to revolutionize the way we can look at the world and how we can mitigate some of the problems that are happening. And that's relevant not only for protecting aquatic life, but also for recreation in terms of how swimmable our waters are. Again, if we have big flood flows, that generally brings in a lot of contamination. And if we can know that in real time, that will be helpful. We have a specific project here in Hamilton at the Mangako Tukutuku. It's an urban research hub, which is looking at the peacocks. It's an new urban development, which is going from green fields through to new housing development. And we're monitoring the impact of those streams as that urbanization takes effect, and how we can minimize the impact on both the organisms that live in those streams and also the quality of that water. And alongside that, we have new models that are being developed that will enable us to predict the water quality under various scenarios of urbanization and particularly how climate impacts are going to have an effect on that. And overarching a lot of our work, we have these larger sort of pollutant load models that enable us to assess and predict what climate change may do and different changes in land use will have as consequences to our rivers and estuaries. Just turning more to my particular focus in research is really looking at treatment of wastewaters. And we have a program that is looking to develop more efficient and cost-effective and but natural green technologies to solve some of our pollution issues that are coming out of our cities. And we work with industry stakeholders, but particularly Maori partners across New Zealand. And a central part of this project is actually to integrate Maori knowledge, Mātauranga Maori, with our cutting-edge scientific innovations. And I think we can learn a lot from the far more holistic worldview that Maori have, and by integrating that with our science. And there's a couple of points I pick up on that. There's one, the role that Maori have as kaitiaki tanga, as custodians and guardians of the environment. Secondly, the Maori worldview, the Te Mana o Te Wai, the interconnectedness of everything. So the health of our waters is highly relevant to the health of our environment, and then the health of us as people. And it's wonderful that philosophy is being embraced by our government policies in the essential fresh water. And then finally, just the intergenerational view that Maori have of the consequences of things we do today, and not just how we look at it in 2 to 3 years' time. It's how we're going to affect things for our next generation. So leaving a legacy, and all of those are so important in this time of great change. So a major climate change issue for many of our towns and cities are greenhouse gas emissions, and a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions from towns and cities, the main ones, could well be from their wastewater treatment plants. So it's a highly relevant issue to look at ways in which we can minimize emissions. And a lot of those come from methane and nitrous oxide. And interestingly, at the COP26 summit, there's now a climate change agreement to reduce global methane emissions by 30% by 2030, which is a big step up from the current 10% by 2030. So this will require, international and nationally led approaches, partnerships to address how we might mitigate and adapt to some of these climate change challenges across the whole wastewater sector. And I think, although I'm going to talk about the wastewater sector, this obviously would transpose to every other sector to do with our urban environments. We have some pretty large knowledge gaps around emission data for wastewater treatment processes that we need to sort out. We need to identify much better control measures and develop new technologies, which is going to require more investment in research, but also training and particularly education of our public, of our communities, of where do things go when you flush? What are the consequences of putting this down your toilet? And how does that affect the health and the quality of water in our streams and rivers? But in many cases, we do have knowledge and we do have tools to start addressing some of these issues today. And picking up on one of Ian's points again, it's our individual responsibility to start to take action. All of us are involved in this. This is a global situation and we can all do our part. And hopefully we'll get to a point where we can transition to an energy and climate neutral cities and particularly wastewater. And we may well be able to transform our wastewater treatment plants into resource recovery centers where we recycle carbon, nitrogen and water for the betterment of society. So, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rupert. That's a brilliant suggestion to end on, the way we actually make the wastewater plant a key element of the circular economy, which is increasingly necessary to have in our minds when we make all these plans to adapt to climate change. Thanks very much. And now I think we're going to move to Lani Tirupa, who I believe you have had some interesting problems of environmental damage, coping with the difficulties caused by natural processes hitting urban areas, and you've had to make some strong community action to set things on a better path. I look forward to hearing, and I'm sure we all do, hearing what you say. Kia ora.
Ora, thank you very much. Tēnā tātou, ko Lani ki reo pa tōku ingoa, no Ngāti Whakaue ki Ohina Motuahau. I am talking to you today from Ohina Motupa, a traditional village in the heart of our Tarawa traditional lands, my Maketu ki Tongariro, so from Maketu on the coast to stretching to Mount Tongariro. We're 5 minutes from Rotorua Central City here. In our pā we have 3 marae, and we're bordered by the Utuhina Stream and Lake Rotorua. And I will go into a few of the issues we've dealt with that were raised earlier. I'm Tarawa Climate Change Coordinator at Tarawa Lakes Trust, and I'm also a member of the Tarawa Climate Change Working Group, who under the umbrella of the Tarawa Lakes Trust partnered with Scion and developed Te Ariki Kōpū, the Tarawa Climate Change Strategy, which we launched on October the 1st. And before I share some kōrero about the style of living and land use desired by the iwi, I thought I'd just give you a little bit of background about the strategy. So Tarawa Lakes Trust are a post-Treaty of Waitangi settlement entity responsible for the management of 14 of the 17 Tarawa lakes in our district. In 2018, Tarawa experienced flooding at Little Waihi on the coast. A tree went through the dining room roof at one of our marae during a storm event. Ngongataha stream flooded the local community there, and coastal erosion caused a landslide, scattering ko iwi, or the remains of Ngāti Whakaue ancestors, onto the beach at Maketu. These all happened in 2018, and at the Tarawa Lakes Trust AGM that year, a lot of the whānau raised the issue of climate change and said, who's talking about it? You know, the climate change is here, the iwi are already starting to feel the impacts. What are we going to do about it? Tarawa Lakes Trust, as I said, are responsible for the management of our Tarawa lakes. They said, they responded by saying, yes, you know, we're watching the climate change impacts on the lakes with, for example, warming water levels and the impacts on taonga species. But in terms of the wider impacts on the iwi, we are happy to facilitate a hui for anybody who's interested. So Tarawa Lakes Trust did that and just opened the hui for anyone who had any type of interest in climate change, from rangatahi to whānau, hapu or iwi representatives. From that, the Tarawa Climate Change Working Group was formed, and we partnered with Scion and Tarawa Lakes Trust to, as I said, put together the strategy, to research and put together the strategy. From that, 6 priority areas were highlighted by our whānau and hapu. These were food and water security and sovereignty, energy security and sovereignty, biodiversity, land use change and practices, circular enterprise and economies, and the last one, adaptation planning and resilience building, which also includes our cultural infrastructure such as our pā, our marae, urupā, our burial grounds, because the impacts of climate change on these affects our identity, our culture, our everyday lives. So that's just a little bit of background on the strategy. From our conversations, we were able to put together a vision of Te Arawa, whānau and hapu in this time of climate change, and I'd just like to share that with you now. Our rivers and lakes are clean. We can drink from them, swim in them, water our gardens from them, and our families can once again supplement our meals and show manaakitanga to our manuhiri by providing freshwater kaimoana on tables at our marae. Our cherished food basket, where our freshwater meets Te Moana Nui a Kiwa, the Pacific Ocean at Maketu and Little Waihi, is restored and protected through appropriate land use within the catchment. Growing, harvesting and eating our own nutritious kai is a normal part of our children's lives. We eat fruit from trees growing on front lawns like we used to, harvest vegetables from home and community gardens to supplement our family meals. Our whānau and communities eat predominantly locally grown food, and our food systems allow the easy sharing of kai amongst ourselves, with other hapu and iwi, and between other communities across Aotearoa. Our wetlands and indigenous rainforests are rebuilt. Our lands, forests and waterways are pest-free. Our indigenous ecosystems are thriving and our taonga species flourishing. The connections between our communities and our natural environment are re-established. We live amongst restored natural landscapes in our villages, towns, suburbs and city. We grow and gather our own rongoa, medicine, and actively spend time in nature as part of everyday living, whether for relaxation, fun, exercise, healing, learning, or while performing green jobs as part of an established green economy. All land use is determined with the health and well-being of our soils, waterways and indigenous ecosystems prioritised. In areas with access to geothermal, our whānau and communities use our ngāwha, our geothermal, to heat our homes, cook our food and bathe in. Every rooftop has solar panels, and we share power with our neighbours and across our communities based on need. Our hapu and iwi utilise the wind, water and sun across our lands to produce extra power for our marae and other collective usage. Our whānau, including those displaced by climate change, live in healthy homes on our papakainga lands. Rotorua city and suburbs are supported by green, biophilic, water-sensitive infrastructure and have been reshaped to support careless communities with easy access to all necessary services and amenities, such as schools, shops, playgrounds, and green spaces. Our places of significance, such as wāhi tapu and cultural heritage sites, are recognised and respected. Our people work for our own iwi-owned and operated businesses, making up food and resource circular economies at marae and community level. There's no waste in our environment. We reduce, reuse, repair, rebuild, refurbish, resell, recycle, and compost everywhere we learn, live, work, gather, and play. Our families understand the changes that climate change may bring. They're emotionally and spiritually prepared for change. Our communities are safe from rising rivers, lakes, seas, and the changing weather. They are resilient, adaptive, ready to work together to mitigate any impacts, and are prepared with emergency management strategies and appropriate resources. This is the future vision of the Indigenous people of these lands, mai maketu ki tongariro. In the words of our Climate Change Working Group convener Nikki Douglas, what we need now is for government and the Climate Change Commission to reflect the interests of Te Awa, enable participation of hapu and iwi in the co-design and co-delivery of initiatives, and a commitment to investments and initiatives led by hapu and iwi. Te Awa ready, we're outcomes focused, and Te Awa are the ideal partner. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's a beautiful example of community resilience and recovery and response to some pretty disastrous events, and a really positive. There are ways that can allow us to deal with the future hazards, and as well as doing that, we know how to live a lifestyle that does not add to the problems we already have in the environment. Thank you so much for that. Now, may I ask, Jamie Toko, if you would be so kind as to tell us about what you have been doing.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Mihi atu ki a koe Professor Rawa koutou mā. So my background is community for 30 years now, and my interest is obviously with the environment and how we can prevent destruction of our land, further prevent destruction of our land. So from a community perspective, low socioeconomic communities' contribution to the climate demise, the environmental demise, is very minimal in my opinion, and that will be because low-income to next to no-income earners don't contribute to the environment in such a way as if they were a lot more wealthy. Although very low income to no income earners, we can be assured that the environment will still feature on their list of what matters to them the most. And that's something that we've seen over the years, that they're happy to have a kai, and as long as they've got a roof over their head and they've got clean drinking water. Also from a Māori perspective, being in the Māori Women's Welfare League for many years now, the environment has always been, as Leilani said, it's a beautiful kōrero tū Leilani, kia ora mō tēnā. So the environment has always been an important component of how we live our lives. As I appreciate what can be done for climate change, Dr. Gaurav, in New Zealand by this government, it still falls short of the very simplest solutions that can be rectified on a daily basis. Now I'm talking about the likes of Fonterra in farming, and just those gases and the unrecyclable products that those type of organisations, big businesses use. So we struggled to comprehend that major players that produce unrecyclable products by the millions continue to do so. Until we can see some progress in these areas, we will continue to have devastating impacts on our environment. I applaud the innovative Parekore initiative, community groups that tirelessly push environmental issues, but they can only go as far as their putia goes, how much funding they get to be active in those areas. So Māori are considered, as you say, Leilani, Māori are considered the kaitiaki of the land, seas, rivers and forests, and it's so beautiful to hear that we can swim in our rivers down to Te Arawa, and where some places in New Zealand we can't do that. This is instilled in us by our tupuna and passed down to our grandchildren. We do our fair share of environmental policing to such a degree that building our own infrastructure, using our own land and resources is an integral position that we know will work and be beneficial for our whānau for the future. And just in closing on that kōrero, it is up to us, but unfortunately not everyone is on the same waka. We ask that we remain resilient and strong to do everything we can to prevent further deprivation and destruction of our environment. Tēnā koutou. Tēnā koutou katoa.
Thank you so much. It's very good to hear how your communities are really trying to live with their traditional concern for the environment, but coping with all the stresses that the modern world imposes on individuals, on people, on families, and of course on the environment. I think there is a tremendous need to really cut the rate of consumption. We've seen some figures very recently of how all these billionaires, like the head of Facebook, Amazon and so on, how they spend in one day more carbon emissions than a whole community does over a year in the poorer parts of a city. And I think this differential needs to change as well. It's part of the social reform that has to sometime come in. We can't have so many people, so few people, very wealthy people, responsible for so much environmental damage. Now I'd like to turn to Vicky Young and ask you to talk about some of the excellent work I understand you've been doing on the council and with your communities.
Koutou. Mihi nui kia koutou. Ko Vicky Young ahau. Nā puhi me te rarawa ngā iwi. I'm very glad to be here today. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the community trust, Te Papanui Enderley Community Trust, that I'm the deputy chair of. And I'm going to talk a little bit about 3 initiatives that we have currently been doing, and these are all connected to how we can make an impact on climate change. So just a little bit of background about Te Papanui Enderley community. So we feel that the community of Te Papanui have been kind of left behind for a long time. And we've been classified as the second highest area in New Zealand for poverty and deprivation. So our trust, the primary focus of our trust initially was just to try and help our community with their health and well-being. So we've worked very hard with the council, with funders, with everyone, and we've seen big changes in our community, which has been fantastic. So one of the things that we've been doing is, firstly, we went to the Hamilton City Council and we said, outside of our building, there is a big park, a large park. So we've asked the City Council, and they have agreed to give us some trees to plant around the edges of our field, of our land, because not only will it beautify the land, it'll also, we want fruit trees that will provide food for our people. So our families, our kids can come and pick whatever fruit they need from the trees that will be provided. And that's one of the things that we've been working on, because trees are good for the climate and good for the air. Living in a city, of course, you know, there's a lot of air pollution, and there's a lot of children in our community that have things such as asthma. So hopefully we're planning to make a difference by having these fruit trees planted sometime in the next few months or early next year. So that's one of our first projects, and we were really delighted that the City Council agreed to help us with that. The second project that we've been working on is that we decided that it was important for our urban community to learn some of our mātauranga Māori in terms of planting. So we have run some workshops on kumara planting and growing, and they have been so successful, we've been asked to do them again. So we will look at doing that next year, because kumara is one of our important plants, and it's important for feeding our people as well. So we would like to reintroduce our mātauranga, our Māori knowledge to our whānau that are working with now, but also to our children. So that brings us to the third project that we've been working on, and that is that we've been hoping and trying to get some funding for a marakai, a community garden. And now we have received some funding. So we've had our ceremony, because we like to do our ceremonies with our elders, and everybody attended. And we've had the turning of the sod, and we're ready. We're ready to develop this marakai community garden. And one of the exciting things about having this community garden is not only can we feed our people, but our people can learn about having gardens themselves. Our rangatahi will help build the garden. Our elders will come and talk about traditional methods of gardening and food production, and our little ones will be able to learn how to plant things and pick vegetables or whatever they choose to. And then our next aim or dream is to get that model of gardening into all of these homes, so that everybody can grow their own garden as well. So I think that by giving our people the education about our ancestral knowledge in terms of food production, that's one tiny step forward. We have a lot of other plans, but in terms of climate change, we've still got a long way to go. There's a lot of things that we can do. We're teaching, we have a after-school leadership course for our young children, and in that we teach them about recycling, we teach them about, healthy healthy food. We teach them all sorts of things that they can take home as well, take home to their parents. And we hope that this will continue as well into the future. We've got big plans next year as well, but small steps, and we've seen a huge change in our community for the better. The children are happier. Everything seems to be doing very well. So we will continue on this journey. Thank you all. It's been very interesting, and I've got a lot of great ideas that I will take back to the trust, and we'll see what else we can do to help us for looking at the past. As Māori do, we look at the past, we look at the present, and then we look at the future and how we can help our whānau and our children move forward, teach them about what they can do to help the climate and help our people. So thank you all. Kia ora koutou.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Sharma. I know he's had to leave us. I really appreciate you telling me about this community work, the development of gardens. It parallels in some ways some of the things that are happening in the less fortunate districts of Manchester and our neighbour city, Liverpool. I remember that we had a national wildflower centre in Liverpool, and there were these great grassy areas around tower blocks of social housing. When they planted wildflowers in that grassland and made it attractive, people came down from their flats and talked to each other. And the local doctors said that their health improved enormously because they had more social interaction with the flowers as the catalyst that got them going. Growing crops, having urban gardens, shared gardens, or your own garden if you're lucky enough. This is so important, and yet the greenery is helping take up CO2. It's all contributing. It's doing actions that give multiple benefits, and that is really good to hear about. Well, I think as time is marching on and Bex has to get things ready in the next 20 minutes or so, could I thank you all very much indeed for your contributions. Can I say I admire the hard work going on in communities preparing for climate change, and it's good to exchange the knowledge, and I hope that exchange will go on and such initiatives will be supported by local government and by national governments to facilitate this multifaceted, multi-scale policies for surviving the climate change that my generation and people before me have caused for present and future generations. I'm thinking at the age of 84 about my grandchildren's children and what a world they will have if people aren't taking the sensible sorts of actions we've been talking about tonight. Thank you all for your contributions.
The University of Waikato is proud to introduce the world's first Bachelor of Climate Change for the people who know there is no Planet B. Gain the skills needed for the jobs of tomorrow. Contribute to a fundamental shift in the way we do business and go about our lives. Explore how Mātauranga Māori can bring perspective to the most pressing issue of our time. Apply now and carve a career where passion and purpose collide.
Kua uea, kua wārea te one tapu, te kaupapa. Mai ea te tupua, mai ea te tawhito. I haere mai koutou I whea, I haere mai koutou I tūwhako o tinuku, I haere mai koutou I tūwhako o tirangi. Ko ngō koutou manawa e, ko ngō mātou manawa e, tāne kaurihia whano, hara mai te toki, haumi e, ui e, tā iki e. Thank you for joining us and for being part of this local initiative in the global context. Or is it a global initiative with a local context? Whichever. Our wrap-up today features firstly our Vice-Chancellor, Neil Quigley, the University of Waikato. Then we have a couple of other speakers. Ian Douglas from the Commonwealth Human Ecology Council, Manchester in England, Margaret Evans of the Commonwealth Human Ecology Council here in the Waikato, and then myself, Tom Rua, Associate Professor of the Faculty of Māori Indigenous Studies, Waikato, Maniapoto. And then we'll end with our karakia as we started from the University Kaumātua, Korotaki, Turner. This time, let's please turn and share with Ian and some of his reflections on what we've been doing over these last few weeks, and perhaps something of what we might be doing moving into the future. Kia ora, Ian.
Thank you very much, Tom, and my congratulations to all concerned, but particularly to Margaret and to you for a tremendous set of sessions. In the Commonwealth Human Ecology Council, we were very anxious to participate fully in COP26, and we heard via the grapevine that the more names we put forward for people to attend, the bigger the chance we would have of having a handful of places. We hoped, of course, that conditions would permit people to come from distant countries, from all parts of the Commonwealth, but unfortunately, as it turned out, with all the travel restrictions and the visa difficulties and so on, those members of Czech who have been in Glasgow came just from the UK. So it's been wonderful to have this opportunity of communicating with people in New Zealand about what has happened in Glasgow, and particularly for me to join the sessions here and learn so much about the innovative things that have been happening in this country. I'm impressed by the general understanding of the problem of climate change and the activity at all levels. Today, we heard from a member of Parliament about what the government had been doing. And in many ways, the government was taking a lead among the world's nations. On the other extreme, we heard about what different Maori communities had been doing in Hamilton and in other places. And this different scales of discussion, different scales of responsibility, different levels of involvement really showed the way we have to go forward. The way we have to go forward is to work together. The whole thing about climate change has been, and it's been here with us for almost 40 years that we've been talking about it, is getting people to realize that we all, in some way or other, are responsible for the things that lead to climate change. Some people much more than others, but we're all in one way responsible, and we all have the responsibility to do something or more than one thing about it. This week, we've been inundated with words and pictures about COP26 and illustrations of what's been happening in other countries. To someone like me who's been working on both the urban environment and rainforests for the last 40 years, I've seen the enormous change that human activity has produced across cities and across landscapes. The loss of forests, the expansion of cities into what had been countryside or even forests themselves, is an essential response to the great increase in the global human population. Now, what we've heard and know about now are ways forward where we can live the sustainable livelihoods that we've also been concerned with for 40 years or 50 years since the Stockholm meeting on the environment in 1972. If we'd have gone down that sustainable line a bit earlier, a bit more effectively, we would have made more progress. Now, at the last minute, we see that we all know what should be done, and some wonderful people like those who participated in these Waikato sessions have been doing or are doing and will do in the future. And I'm still encouraged that if we get enough enthusiasm and continue the momentum that's risen at this time through COP26 and through wonderful efforts like those here in this set of sessions, we will be able to do something. And I really admire the way everything has been conducted here. It's been very good intellectually. It's been very effective technically, and we owe an enormous debt to the events people in the university. But I think I've been very privileged to be with you at this time, and thank you for letting me do so. Czech is grateful to you for what you have done and recognizes now that one of the side benefits of this dreadful pandemic has been this ability of us to talk together through things like Zoom and bring the Commonwealth and other organizations together to recognize the common purpose and to learn the lessons rather more rapidly than we used to before we had this direct, instant communication. Thanks again for the privilege.
Tēnā koe, Ian, thank you. The privilege has entirely been ours in your sharing your wisdom with us. And in terms of being thankful for that privilege, we now turn to our Vice-Chancellor, Neil Quigley, to share some of his reflections on COP26 and on this initiative. Kia ora, Neil.
E rao rangatira e hoa tēnei te mihi kia koutou katoa. Over the last 2 weeks, the University of Waikato has offered an opportunity for all New Zealanders to think globally and act locally by entering our specially crafted portal to share the experience of the 26th Conference of the Parties in Glasgow. We've assembled local commentators and panellists to share their reflections of climate challenges, policy and action. and provided an opportunity for you to use our feedback service to share your views. A key benefit of this process has been to bring together people who live and work very near each other, but who previously had little direct engagement on these issues of mutual interest. It has also consolidated the thinking and the interests of three key institutions in the Waikato region: the Waikato Regional Council, Waikato Tainui, and the University of Waikato. Between our three institutions, we expect an ongoing program of engagement and dialogue about climate issues to be a key outcome of this initiative. I would like to thank Te Mata Ahurangi Associate Professor Tom Roa, Margaret Evans, and my colleagues at the university for leading this initiative. In particular, can I thank the university events team for all their work and for the long hours they put in to bring this program to you. I hope that all of you have found the program informative and useful in following and reflecting on the Conference of the Parties and the very important issues that it is addressing. Kia tau te rangimārie, o ranginui e tu iho nei, o papatua nuku e te koto nei, o te tai au I awhi nei, ki runga I a tato katoa, tihei mauri ora.
Kei te tumu aki, e neo. Tēnā koe, tēnā koutou, ko ngā mana whakahare o te wharewana o Waikato, e manaki nei tēnei kaupapa. E whakatū whena nei, I ngā rauhanga o te wharewananga, kia horahia ngā kupu, ki te ao, hio tira, ki te rohe. Tēnā koe, tēnā koutou. Thank you, Neil. And in particular, thank you for lending us your team to enable this sharing of thought, but more of what is actually being done in this very, very important question. And one of the thinkers, one of the doers for some time in this space is former Mayor of Hamilton City, Margaret Evans. Ka huri ki a koe, Margaret.
Kia ora, Tom. Kia ora koutou. What a great couple of weeks it's been. And I want to also join you and Vice-Chancellor Neil and Professor Ian and say thank you to absolutely everybody that's been involved. We suspect that there's been more than 60 panellists and they've all jumped to this cause, some of them with just a few hours notice, which I think is a fine illustration of the passion that is there if we spend a bit of time looking at it. I do want to give a bit of an overview, and as you have said, Tom, and as Professor Ian has said, this has been a subject that's been dear to my heart for many decades, and I don't think I'm on my own if I say I was one of the youthful readers of Rachel Carson's book way back in the 70s, and Ian mentioned the Stockholm Conference, which is when the United Nations first began to address this issue of climate change, and the answer somehow being in what we call sustainable development. And I want to make the first point here that has been made by several of our panellists. This is not just about the climate. This is also about poverty. And it's particularly about urban poverty, which I think we need to take note of. And as we've been working through this last 2 weeks, it kept coming to me that sustainable development is actually about sustenance. And one of the things that we do need to face up to is greed. We are a global society, unfortunately, that has a culture of greed, and I'm marking that as one of the first points. I'm also going to go back to the beginning 2 weeks ago of Glasgow, and that wonderful young woman who's now a global influencer, I hope, Greta Thunberg. And she used that expression, blah, blah, blah. Well, you know, she will be joined by an awful lot of people in this country and in this city that will go on to say, we are a little bit sick of the blah, blah, blah. What we do need now is more action. And what we need to do is recognise there is already lots of action and bring the action together so we have this magnificent molecule with all its little tiny, tiny bits all beavering away. And that's how we will make the change that we want to make against global warming, but also to pursue this vision, that's an ancient vision, of a beautiful world where humanity works together with nature. And I'm going to use the Māori expressions here. Tom, thanks to you and our mana whenua and tangata whenua in this country who are constantly reminding us, as they should, about mātauranga Māori. And I want to pick up just a few of those expressions because they've come through time and time again in the last 2 weeks here in Hamilton. One is kaitiakitanga. It is about integration. We are all mixed up together in this place that we call home, planet Earth. That's about kotahitanga. That's actually about leaders and academics and flex roots all working together, listening to each other and having kōrero. And Tom, you were the one that used the term the wānanga. We need lots and lots and lots of wānanga, and we need to repeat them because we have this lovely expression about 3 readings of the bill. And yes, it's quite right. Most of us need to be told 3 times before we finally get the message. Well, we've had more than 3 decades, so let's work on that. One of the other themes that came through time and time again in Glasgow, but also here through our University of Waikato host, has been systemic reform. The status quo is no longer an option. And I think Rupert Craigs made the point that this is not about building bigger and bigger and bigger sewerage systems. This is about integrating systems with Mother Earth, using the knowledge of how Mother Earth operates to help us fix up the problems we human beings cause. Innovate and share the knowledge is the other big message. I want to give 3 quick examples of what I saw as some of the priorities that came through. And I think Nānaya Mahuta, our minister, made reference of this right at the beginning. And Gaurav Sharma, our local MP, he also picked up the point, forestry. But the bad news is we don't want more monocultural pine trees. We want the restoration of forest. We want the rehabilitation of the land with the forest canopy, because that also, as a side one, should be something that we should take into account for land restoration, but using timber to build our houses. That was a point that's been made several times. Also, transport was a big one. And I think there's been an open invitation that we should all stomp on SUVs and utes. That's the urban fashion. It's all right for the plumber and for the farmer, but hey, come on, yes. And I think as Ian has pointed out to us, public transport is very, very important, but so is walking and so is cycling. And Ian came up with a very interesting point that COVID has had an impact on public transport in Britain, because people are more reluctant, it seems, to keep using it because of COVID and people who are not using their masks. So there's a learning for us as well. A summary: we need to reform our building regulations. We need to get rid of a lot of red tape. And this brings us back to Enderley. there's a perfect opportunity to create, using the local people to create a new village. And that's not just the buildings. That's also a place for them to gather, as they said, to use their community gardens, to plant the fruit trees, to let the people get back to the idea of sustaining themselves in attractive, warm homes. Solar panels. There's so many elements that could be incorporated in such a design element. And to go back to the idea of urban forests, I'm thinking of the nature panel, who reminded us again and again, our children not only love to walk in the bush, it is so good for them, like it's good for us. There is nothing more guaranteed to get rid of stress than re-engagement with a walk. And I can commend people to the beautiful walks along the river in the Hamilton Gardens. Wonderful for the head, wonderful for the soul. I'm going to make the final point. Money does not cure everything, but as my Scottish grandmother probably said, it's very helpful. And when I think of the millions, and in fact billions, that are available in the world today, and I'm not just talking about public dollars, I'm talking about philanthropic dollars, it is important that they go towards some of the big projects. But let's also not forget the small groups who need to have the fruit trees to plant in the gardens for their local neighbourhoods. And I'm going to conclude by just a couple of numbers. For anybody visiting Hamilton, they will be able to see the Wairere Drive, Cobham Drive intersection, where a new bridge is being built, and it'll be $150 million before it's finished. And that intersection alone is costing $59 million of public money. Well, I know where I would have sooner seen that money spent. We've had a wonderful 2 weeks. It's now an opportunity for us to move on to sharing this information. And thank you, Neil, for the opportunity to have wānanga and share the information with more and more and more people. This is the ripple on the lake. We've put a little wave in there again. Let's make this into ripples so we really can change the waves. Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa.
Tēnā koe, Margaret. Thank you for the depth and the breadth of those thoughts. And as you were talking, I was watching Ian's body language, and there were some real nods as you were talking. Ian, do you want to comment on some of what Margaret has said, please?
I thought Margaret's ideas were very appropriate. I just would like to take up the point about nature in the urban areas. We have, in many countries, urban green space standards. A child must be able to find a green space within 6 minutes walk. There should be a park big enough to play in within a kilometre. And these standards are very sensible, and they often show the disparity in the accessibility of green space, the differences between poorer areas and more wealthy areas. Often the wealthy areas have more access, but it's the people in the poor areas who probably need more access. So working towards that sort of goal is working towards both sustainability and to creating more mitigation of climate change. There's so many things like that that are win-wins. You get so many benefits out of one project, and I do commend that to everybody. But I think it's this opportunity that is now there, now people know each other, is to engage between the national government, the region and the local governments, private enterprise, and the communities, and the scientists and scholars in academia, and the people on the ground. And often it's the case that you have an ideal to become involved and want to be involved, but how do you make that bridge? How do you get the academic to talk to the farmers or the people in the communities? What way do you come to discuss this? And I found when I was in a smaller town in Australia, they had a tradition of doing applied research for the community. I used to get phoned up. This is such and such Shire Council. Will you come and talk to us about our plans for forestry? Or will you come and talk to us about this? Can you find a student to do a project which will tell us that? And in the end, you end up having more people coming than you can cope with, but it does help actually make you do work that answers fundamental academic questions as well as serving the community. And I've not done quite as much of that as I have since in Manchester, but I certainly have in Czech, where we are encouraging those small projects that touch a lot of people's lives. And I think that's a kind of responsibility that some academics at least need to carry forward and keep carrying forward. And it's good to see how much of it's going on with you people in Waikato. I think we've got to not let the momentum drop, though. If this time the momentum drops, that fractions of a degree of global warming will accelerate. And setting target dates makes everybody think, oh, we don't have to do anything to 2030 or 2035. We have to do it now. We should have done it earlier. About 20 years ago, just before I formally retired from the university, I said in a lecture to my students on my course on sustainable development, my generation has not done what it should have done. It's made a mess of the earth. It's up to your generation to try to do some of it. And I was pleased when 10 years later I came across one of the students who's working for an environmental consultancy, said, Prof, I listened to what you said. I'm actually doing it. And I think if we can persuade a few people to be a bit more like that student, we will be in a better world.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. And I'm taken by your saying that academics talking to farmers, academics talking to grassroots people challenging academics. And Margaret, you talked about wānanga. You shared a thought a couple of days ago about a possible movement forward from this, and the Vice-Chancellor mentioned it in his address. Would you like to expand a little bit on that thought?
Well, it grows every time I think about it. I think bearing in mind we have essentially a four-way or a three-way partnership that we've developed here, which is the University of Waikato, Waikato Tainui, the local people, and of course the Waikato Regional Council. You have to add into that the various NGOs, civil society, the representatives of the community. So you can see it's an interesting shape. But clearly they all want to kōrero more, they all want to talk more, they all want to listen more. So I think we should respond to that. And it's important that not one group hosts it all the time. I think it would be appropriate that the university, as the digital host of this last 2 weeks, be the first place. And with fingers crossed about COVID, we always have the fallback, it can be done with Zoom, but it would be great to have the kanohi ki kanohi gathering and have it at the university. And I'm mindful for Neil that we always need to remember that for many people, the university is the other place. It's not their place, and it needs to be their place. And Ian, for your benefit, it sits in the most beautiful, beautiful grounds. It's like a park, and we're better to attract people to come to Kōrero, to listen and have a bit of a chat in the park while they're about it. So I would say that's the first place. And Tom, I think it would be wonderful to have Waikato Tainui to open the doors either to Hopo, which was always established as a learning centre, or at your palace to Rangawaiwai. How wonderful to again engage with people who may never have been there before, and there's lots of those too. The third pillar, of course, is the Waikato Regional Council, and it covers, Ian, the whole of this centre part of New Zealand up to Auckland and to both coasts. And they've got magnificent new, it is said, a green building in the central city, which would be another wonderful place to have a wānanga. And then if we were very, very adventurous, we would go out into the community. And you have had Jamie Toka, who chairs the board at Western Community Centre, which is quite a large place. And it would be wonderful to have a wānanga there. But you've also got Vicky Young from Te Papanui, Enderley, and there is a school right there. In fact, there's a couple of schools right there. We have potential here to take seminars out to the people, build on the discussions that, as you said, Ian, we've been having for the last 40 or 50 years, but more particularly over the last 2 weeks, and remind people that 2030 is only 8 years away. So we've got a bit of time. And I think we have to make them regular, like monthly, so that people get into the habit of knowing that there's always a conversation going on about an interesting topic each month. Town talks, TED talks, Waikato talks.
Yes, and it's, wānanga is not just talk.
No, I know.
Sir Robert Mahuta had this mantra, no research without development and no development without research. So by sharing these wānanga over those spaces, Ian, are there other examples internationally where that has perhaps been explored?
Yes. After the big Rio de Janeiro conference of 1992, pushing for sustainable development, the UN set up Local Agenda 21. And we had these committees, and in the end, I ended up chairing the City of Manchester's Local Agenda 21 Forum. It was a bit of a toothless committee, but what was really a learning curve was it had 5 councillors, and then it had 3 academics, 3 people from the business community, 3 people from utilities, 3 people from this group and that group, and community people, nature lovers and so on. The 12 different groups represented, and that was a sort of top-down formula. But in fact, people would discuss things with each other, and if it had a bit, that sort of format had a bit more power and or a bit more financial clout, it could be very effective way of getting this. But I think we need patterns of engagement on specific activities. One of the activities that has been most effective in the Manchester region in bringing people together has been the restoration of former industrial and mining land, where you try to recreate a natural habitat through regeneration, and you get the people living around the area of the old coal mine waste tips or former slag heaps to work on the replanting and care for the pathways that are put through it, help restore the rivers. That sort of engagement is very, very effective, and we have a very good model for that in Greater Manchester. But I think it's only going to be sustained when there is leadership, and when there, in these restoration projects, there's big government money coming in and paying for some of the heavy work. But it is a very effective way of engaging with the communities. And I think there's no set way of doing it. And you have to have people who want to do that little bit extra to step outside the normal job description. And sometimes you have to push the normal job description aside to get on with what's really important. And I think that's what we've been doing these last 2 weeks.
Thank you. Margaret, have you any sort of concluding thoughts that you might have missed out?
Only, it's interesting listening to Ian talk about Agenda 21. And Ian, you won't know this, but Hamilton City and Waikato region were the first two in New Zealand local bodies to pick up and adopt Agenda 21. And I could give a speech on this that might last a couple of weeks, but I won't. We had over 4,000 people involved in workshopping over nearly 2 years. And all of that thought was condensed down to one piece of paper, which I now promise to leaflet to everybody, that we called The Cloud. And if you compare this with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, they are identical. And I bet you could all talk about them. What do people want? They want nature. They want a safe place. They want a safe place to raise their children. They want opportunities for access to healthcare. They want opportunities for education. All of the things that humanity share. Now, what is interesting is we did an outturn report, and the most common comment from all these 4,000 odd people, I think it was 5,000 actually, because we had 1,000 young people as well. The most common comment was their disappointment when the workshop stopped.
Yeah.
They wanted the ongoing engagement. And I've never forgotten that, because what is the message? People love to soak up and talk about and share the ideas and learn about the ideas. But on the other hand, they also want to do something. And so you go from engagement to participation. And that is unchanging. So, you know, Ian, your point about Manchester links back to our point about Enderley. We have an ideal opportunity in this city. We've talked about Peacocks being a new greenfields area, but you haven't got the people in there yet. You've got Enderley, which is an existing area, which is ripe for redevelopment. There's an opportunity there to do everything we did under Agenda 21. feed in some ideas, let them talk about them, let them argue about them. Everything from the design of their houses to where they want to put the community gardens, notice plural, and then let them hands-on become engaged. That's the unfailing recipe, I think, everywhere from the beginning of time. When we had just small units, the small units became bigger units, which gave us villages, and they all worked well when people felt they had a place, where they felt they had a future, and where they felt they had a past. And it was only when the villages got to be bigger and the princes became greedy with the idea of being kings. Yes, I think we can look back and resurrect some of the ideas that are still valid, but the message is engagement and participation.
Thank you, Margaret. And as the local face of the Commonwealth Human Ecology Council, I wonder if you might share some thoughts about Zina Daesh.
I thought about Zina today, not just because of our sessions coming to a conclusion, but to remind myself, Ian, it's 10 years. It's 10 years that Zina left us. And for those who don't yet know of her, I will just simply say a New Zealander right to the day she died, even though she had taken upon her heart to live in London, really on and off, probably from immediately after the Second World War. Diminutive, beautiful. Her eyes were almost Ming blue, and I don't think there was a prime minister or president who had not had those eyes focused on them as she sought more, always more, to change the world. Her concept of human ecology combined the idea of kaitiakitanga, but also with, I would add, her interest in Buddhist and Indian concepts of soul sharing. And she was determined, I'm sure, from the day she was born until the day she died, that she would make a better world. So hers was a great life, lived fully, contributed greatly, and I'll conclude by saying, including a great wallop from her estate to the University of Waikato to fund fellowships for the future. And this couple of weeks, we've had Shalini Joffa from the Maldives, who is the current Zina Daesh scholar. And the Maldives, of course, being one of the small island nations that is threatened by climate change. So Zina, I have absolutely no doubts, is probably hovering around that mountain of yours, Tom, looking down upon us, and I think would be very pleased with the last 2 weeks, Ian.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. We perhaps haven't put the message quite as forcefully as Zina would have put it, because she had that way of doing it. But it is there. Caring for the world, caring for other people, but taking individual responsibility.
And have fun while you're doing it.
Yes. You've got to have something of that element of fun and that just that little quirk in everything that we do. So if I just, in closing us, suggest a little Māori quirk. Firstly, that our oral history talks about Governor Gray meeting with one of our tupuna and asking our tupuna, how many gods are there in the Māori pantheon? And our tupuna said to him, one. And Gray says, yeah, but you got Rangi and Papa. And our tupuna says, yes, and they are one. We can't have rangi without papa, and we can't have papa without rangi. And all of those who live in between, when an orator stands to speak, very often that orator will begin their speech with the phrase, Tihei Mauri ora. And in that phrase, I suggest that a tihei is a sneeze, and the Mauri ora is about the well-being of all, everything, and everyone. Ian, I really appreciate your being with us throughout these last 2 weeks, and I'm hopeful that we might actually meet kanohi ki te kanohi and be able, when the COVID-19 restrictions ease, we might have you here and we might share a meal and take you to some of these spaces like the mountain behind me, Mount Piringia. Margaret, thank you for being who you are and for spearheading and really pushing me along in pushing the university along. And to the university, Sean, Aidan, Bex, all of you of the events team, Tihei Mauri ora. Let's now turn to our kaumatua, korotaki tūna, to close us. But this is not the end. This is the end of a continuum. And that continuum we will find. Ki te whaiao, ki te ao marama. Tihei Mauri ora.
Ka tākina te kawa. Ka tākina te kawa ki te whaiao, ki te ao marama. Tihei Mauri ora. Tuatahi ngā mihi ki te tumuaki o te whare wānanga o Waikato. Neil Quigley, tēnā kia koe. Me te mārei kura Margaret Evans, te manu kāhui, o kirikiri roa I tōna wā. E kui, tēnā kia koe. E hoki ake, ki taka mania pototanga, ārā, ki taka whanaunga, e tame, tā kuta tame e roa, tēnā koutou. Ārā, tēnā koutou, I hiki nei, ni ki I tēnei kaupapa. Kaupapa o te kanohi ki te kanohi, tangata ki te tangata, reo ki te reo, hei oranga mo te whaiao, o te ao marama. Kāti. E reira ka hoki anō ngā kupu, kia kingi tū heiti a pōtatau te wherawhero te tuahitu. Amo hia ki te ora o te iwi, ka puti ki te whaiao, ki te ao marama. Nā reira, kia tau kia tātou, kia te whai o tō tātou ariki a Ukraiti me te aroha te atua, e te whiwhinga tahitanga ki te wairua tapu, ake, 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 amen.
The University of Waikato is proud to introduce the world's first Bachelor of Climate Change for the people who know there is no planet B. Gain the skills needed for the jobs of tomorrow. Contribute to a fundamental shift in the way we do business and go about our lives. Explore how Mātauranga Māori can bring perspective to the most pressing issue of our time. Apply now and carve a career where passion and purpose collide.